Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right seat? The question hung in the first-class cabin of Delta Flight 1247 like a guillotine blade, sharp and final. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, and those 8 words would trigger the most expensive 30 minutes in American aviation history. Dr. Danielle Carter looked up from her laptop, her expression unchanged. At 45, she had learned to navigate moments like these with surgical precision. The woman standing before her, blonde, perfectly pressed uniform, name tag reading Sarah Mitchell, Senior Flight Attendant, wore the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "I believe so," Danielle replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being questioned. She gestured to a boarding pass. "Seat 2A. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't looking at the boarding pass. She was looking at Danielle, taking inventory of her simple black blazer, her understated jewelry, her lack of designer luggage, making calculations that had nothing to do with seat assignments and everything to do with assumptions that would soon cost Delta Airlines more than their entire quarterly diversity budget. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman she was about to humiliate had signed Delta's operational budget just 6 hours earlier. The woman whose right to sit in first class she was questioning owned the very seat she was sitting in, along with the other 299 seats on this Boeing 757 and the 864 other aircraft in Delta's fleet. Dr. Danielle Carter stepped through the jet bridge at JFK International Airport, carrying nothing more than a leather laptop bag and the weight of a morning that had already stretched her patience thin. The quarterly board meeting had run 3 hours over schedule, delayed by endless debates over cost-cutting measures that she knew would ultimately impact the very passengers she was about to join. She had specifically chosen to fly commercial today instead of taking the corporate jet. It was a decision born partly from practicality — the Gulfstream was undergoing maintenance — and partly from principle. How could she make decisions about passenger experience without occasionally being a passenger herself? Her phone buzzed with the 14th message from her assistant. "WSJ wants comment on the Spirit Airlines acquisition by 5 p.m. She silenced it. The Wall Street Journal could wait. Right now, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into seat 2A, review the quarterly reports, and prepare for tomorrow's Federal Aviation Administration meeting, where she would discuss Delta's new customer service initiatives. The irony of what was about to unfold would not be lost on her later. She had dressed deliberately understated that morning, a simple black blazer from Nordstrom, not the Armani suits she typically wore to board meetings. Her jewelry was minimal: wedding ring, small diamond earrings, a watch her father had given her when she graduated from Wharton 23 years ago. To anyone looking, she appeared to be exactly what she was: a professional woman traveling on business. What they couldn't see was the rest of the story. As she approached the first-class cabin, she noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that always preceded these moments. The flight attendant's smile faltered just slightly. Eyes narrowed in barely perceptible calculation. The pleasant "welcome aboard" that had greeted the white gentleman ahead of her was replaced by a cooler assessment. Sarah Mitchell had been with Delta for 15 years, long enough to develop what she considered an expert eye for first-class passengers. She prided herself on being able to spot the real first-class travelers from those who had lucked into upgrades or were flying on someone else's dime. In her mind, there was a certain look, a certain presence that belonged in the premium cabin. When Danielle Carter walked through the cabin door, Sarah's internal alarm system activated immediately. The woman was well dressed, certainly, but her clothes lacked the obvious expense markers Sarah associated with frequent first-class flyers. No Hermès bag, no Louboutin shoes, no conspicuous display of wealth that would immediately signal her right to be there. More troubling to Sarah's worldview, she was black, and in Sarah's 15-year career, she could count on one hand the number of black women who had occupied first-class seats without what she considered explanation, celebrity status, obvious athletic achievement, or corporate sponsorship that she could immediately identify. "Good afternoon," Danielle said pleasantly as she approached row 2, her voice carrying the neutral professional tone of someone accustomed to being in rooms where her presence was questioned. Sarah watched as Danielle located seat 2A and began to settle in. The laptop she pulled out was expensive, but not flashy, a MacBook Pro that could belong to any business professional. Her movements were efficient, practiced, suggesting someone comfortable in premium travel environments. But these observations only deepened Sarah's suspicion rather than alleviating it. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching with the boarding manifest in hand, though she had no intention of actually consulting it. "May I see your boarding pass?" The request was not unusual in itself, but it was the first time that afternoon Sarah had asked to verify anyone's seat assignment. The white businessman in 1A had been welcomed with a warm smile and an offer of champagne. The elderly white woman in 3B had been asked about her comfort preferences. The middle-aged white man in 4A had been offered assistance with his carry-on. Danielle handed over her boarding pass without hesitation, though she had already noticed the pattern of treatment in the cabin. Of course, Sarah examined the pass with theatrical thoroughness, turning it over as though searching for hidden information. The pass was perfectly legitimate. Delta Sky Club member, seat 2A, first class, purchased 3 weeks in advance under the name Dr. Danielle Carter. But legitimacy was not what Sarah was questioning. "I need to verify this with our system," Sarah announced, loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "There seems to be some irregularity." There was no irregularity. The system would confirm exactly what the boarding pass stated. But the verification request served a different purpose. It established doubt, created a scene, and put Danielle in the position of having to prove her right to occupy a seat she had purchased legally. 2 other flight attendants, sensing drama, had begun to hover nearby. James Peterson, a junior flight attendant, exchanged glances with Sarah. They had worked together long enough to communicate without words, and the message was clear. This passenger didn't belong. Danielle remained seated, her expression unchanged, but her mind was cataloguing everything. The selective ID checking, the unnecessary verification, the growing audience of crew members, the way conversations in surrounding seats had quieted as passengers became aware of the disturbance. She had seen this pattern before, had studied it in the discrimination reports that crossed her desk monthly. But experiencing it personally added layers of understanding that no corporate report could convey. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I contact our reservation department," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance. The request was absurd. Passengers were not typically asked to vacate their seats for administrative verification, but it was delivered with the confidence of established protocol. Danielle remained seated. "I prefer to wait here, thank you. I'm sure your system will confirm my reservation momentarily." The response clearly frustrated Sarah, who had expected immediate deference. In her experience, passengers who were confused about their seating assignments typically became flustered when challenged, making her job easier. Danielle's calm confidence was not following the script. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that first-class seating requires verification of premium status," Sarah continued, now inventing policies that existed nowhere in Delta's actual procedures. "We have protocols for ensuring the security and comfort of our premium passengers." A businessman in seat 1B looked up from his newspaper, his expression suggesting he had never been asked to verify his premium status, despite flying first class monthly for the past decade. His presence went unacknowledged by Sarah, whose attention remained fixed on Danielle. "I understand your protocols," Danielle replied, her tone remaining professional despite the growing absurdity of the situation. "I've been flying Delta for over 20 years and have maintained Diamond Medallion status for the past 15. I'm familiar with your policies." The mention of Diamond Medallion status, Delta's highest tier of frequent flyer benefits, should have ended the conversation immediately. Diamond members were among Delta's most valued customers, typically spending tens of thousands of dollars annually with the airline. But Sarah's prejudices had already overridden her professional training. "Anyone can claim status," Sarah said dismissively. "I need to see documentation." The request was unprecedented and violated multiple company policies regarding customer service and privacy. Frequent flyer status was verified through the reservation system, not through documentation that passengers were expected to carry. But Sarah was no longer operating within established protocols. She was improvising based on bias. Danielle reached for her phone, not to provide documentation, but to begin creating her own record of the interaction. With practiced discretion, she started the voice recording function and placed the device on the armrest, screen facing down. "I'm happy to wait while you complete your verification process," she said, her words now being captured digitally. "I trust your system will confirm what we both already know." The confidence in her voice clearly irritated Sarah, who had expected either compliance or confrontation, not this maddening composure. She turned to consult with James Peterson, their conversation conducted in whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to prevent Danielle from hearing fragments. "Doesn't look right. Probably upgraded. Need to handle this carefully." While they conferred, Danielle sent a brief text message to her assistant. "Need complete customer service incident report for flight DL-1247. Standard documentation protocol." The message appeared innocuous, but would trigger a comprehensive review process that few at Delta realized existed. Captain Michael Torres emerged from the cockpit, having been summoned by Sarah's increasingly dramatic signals. At 52, Torres commanded respect through a combination of experience and an authoritative presence that had served him well in his 20-year career. His arrival marked an escalation that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Torres asked, his tone carrying the weight of ultimate authority within the aircraft's confines. His question was directed to Sarah, not to Danielle, a choice that immediately established whose version of events he was prepared to trust. Sarah seized the opportunity to present her case. "Captain, we have a passenger in first class who cannot provide adequate verification of her seating assignment. She claims to have diamond status, but given the circumstances, I felt it prudent to confirm before departure." The phrase "given the circumstances" hung in the air like an accusation. No circumstances had been presented other than Danielle's presence in the seat she had purchased. The implication was clear to everyone within earshot. Captain Torres glanced at Danielle with the cursory assessment of someone making rapid judgments. What he saw, a black woman in business attire, sitting calmly in first class, apparently aligned with whatever assumptions Sarah had communicated during their whispered consultation. "Ma'am," he said, his tone suggesting patience worn thin before the conversation had begun. "We have policies in place to ensure the comfort and security of all our passengers. If there's been some confusion about your seating assignment, we're happy to relocate you to an available seat in our main cabin." The offer was presented as a courtesy, but it was effectively an ultimatum delivered with the full weight of Federal Aviation Authority. Passengers who refused to comply with crew instructions faced potential criminal charges, a fact that Captain Torres's tone made abundantly clear. "There's no confusion about my seating assignment," Danielle replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the escalating situation. "I purchased seat 2A 3 weeks ago, I checked in online this morning, and I'm currently sitting in the seat that appears on my boarding pass. What specific policy requires me to relocate?" The directness of her question caught Captain Torres off guard. He had expected either immediate compliance or emotional protest, not a reasoned request for clarification that highlighted the absence of any legitimate justification for their demands. "Our crew has discretionary authority to address seating issues as they arise," he said, falling back on vague regulatory language that sounded official but provided no actual explanation. "I understand crew authority," Danielle responded, "but I don't understand what seating issue you're addressing. Could you please clarify what problem my current seating arrangement is causing?" The question was legitimate and professionally phrased, but it had the effect of cornering both Sarah and Captain Torres into explaining the unexplainable. They could not articulate why Danielle's presence in Seat 2A constituted a problem without revealing the discriminatory assumptions underlying their actions. Sarah, growing increasingly frustrated by Danielle's composure, decided to abandon subtlety entirely. "Look, first class is reserved for premium passengers who understand the expectations of this cabin. We can't have people who don't belong here disrupting the experience for our valued customers." The statement was breathtakingly direct in its discrimination, spoken loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One elderly gentleman in row 3 made eye contact with Danielle and shook his head slightly, a gesture of solidarity that she acknowledged with a brief nod. "I see," Danielle said, her voice now carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. "And how exactly do you determine who belongs in first class? Is it based on the ticket they purchased, their frequent flyer status, or some other criteria?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Any honest answer would reveal the discriminatory nature of their treatment, but the continued evasion was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of Danielle's systematic questioning. Captain Torres, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his crew's ability to manage it gracefully, made a decision that would prove to be the most expensive mistake of his career. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane voluntarily, or we'll be forced to contact security. This is your final warning." The ultimatum electrified the cabin atmosphere. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Newspapers were lowered. All pretense of privacy vanished as 36 first-class passengers found themselves unwilling witnesses to a confrontation that was rapidly escalating beyond normal airline customer service disputes. Danielle remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her mind was racing through calculations. She had 3 options: comply with the illegal demand and validate discriminatory behavior, escalate the confrontation and risk criminal charges, or exercise the nuclear option that her unique position afforded her. She chose a 4th path. "Captain Torres," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that several passengers would later describe as quietly dangerous. "Before you contact security, I'd like to make one phone call. Is that acceptable, or am I being denied that right as well?" The request was reasonable and legally protected, but it clearly irritated the captain, who interpreted it as a stalling tactic. "Make it quick. We have a departure schedule to maintain." Danielle retrieved her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. The call connected after 1 ring. "Delta Executive Emergency Line. This is Director Morrison." "Jim, this is Danielle Carter. I need you to conference in legal, operations, and corporate security immediately. We have a code blue situation on flight 1247. The conversation was conducted at normal volume, but the words code blue, Delta's internal designation for a discrimination incident requiring executive intervention, sent ripples through the cabin. Several passengers recognized the terminology from news reports about airline discrimination cases. Director Morrison's voice became immediately alert. "Dr. Carter, are you saying you're personally experiencing a discrimination incident?" "I'm saying I'm sitting in seat 2A, which I purchased legally, and your crew is demanding I relocate to economy class because they've determined I don't belong in first class. The captain has threatened to have me removed by security." The words were measured and precise, but they carried the weight of a formal complaint being filed in real time. Captain Torres, who had been following the conversation with growing unease, suddenly realized he was listening to something far more serious than a customer service dispute. "Dr. Carter, please hold the line. I'm connecting our Chief Operating Officer immediately." The phone call had accomplished exactly what Danielle intended. It had introduced uncertainty into a situation where Sarah and Captain Torres had felt completely in control. They were no longer dealing with a passenger they could intimidate. They were dealing with someone who had direct access to Delta's executive leadership and knew exactly how to activate the company's crisis management protocols. While waiting for the call to connect, Danielle addressed Captain Torres directly. "Captain, I'm going to ask you one final time to explain what policy I've violated that justifies your threat to have me forcibly removed from a seat I purchased legally." Captain Torres found himself in an impossible position. He could not provide a legitimate policy justification, but backing down now would mean admitting that his crew had acted based on discriminatory assumptions. His next words would be preserved in the federal investigation report that would follow. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but on this aircraft, my crew's authority is absolute. If they say you don't belong in first class, then you don't belong in first class." The statement was not only discriminatory, but factually incorrect regarding federal aviation regulations, crew authority limitations, and passenger rights. It was also being recorded by multiple devices in the cabin, as several passengers had begun documenting the confrontation. "Jim," Danielle said into her phone, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of executive authority, "you can hear Captain Torres's position. I want full documentation of this incident, complete crew interviews within the hour, and a preliminary legal assessment of liability exposure. Also, please have our corporate jet standing by at JFK." The mention of "our corporate jet" sent another shockwave through the cabin. Passengers began exchanging glances, sudden realizations dawning on faces throughout first class. The woman being discriminated against wasn't just any customer. She was someone with access to Delta's corporate fleet. Sarah Mitchell, who had been watching the phone conversation with growing alarm, finally grasped the magnitude of her mistake. Her face went pale as she realized that her 15-year career was likely ending in real time. Who are you?" she whispered, the question barely audible but heard throughout the now silent cabin. Danielle looked up from her phone, meeting Sarah's eyes with a gaze that was both compassionate and implacable. "I'm the person you've been discriminating against for the past 20 minutes. I'm also the chairman of the board of directors of Delta Air Lines." The silence that followed Danielle's revelation was profound and absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs when reality shifts so fundamentally that human minds require time to process the new information. 36 passengers, 4 flight attendants, and 1 captain all experienced the same moment of cognitive recalibration. Sarah Mitchell's legs gave out. She grabbed the nearest seat back for support, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. The woman she had spent the past 20 minutes humiliating, whose right to exist in first class she had questioned, whose dignity she had systematically attacked, was not just any customer. She was the customer. She owned the airline. Captain Torres had turned grey. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, like a fish pulled from water. The authority he had wielded so confidently 30 seconds earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just threatened the person who signed his paychecks. "Oh my God!" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God!" The phone in Danielle's hand crackled with activity. "Dr. Carter, this is Chief Operating Officer Williams. I have legal, security, and media relations on the line. We're treating this as our highest priority crisis management situation." "Thank you, Patricia," Danielle replied, her voice now carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to managing multi-billion-dollar operations. "I want a full incident report within the hour, complete crew interviews and performance reviews, and an immediate assessment of training protocol failures that led to this situation." She paused, looking around the cabin at faces that were now watching her with a mixture of fascination and newfound respect. Several passengers were openly recording the conversation, understanding that they were witnessing corporate history. I also want our discrimination prevention task force activated immediately. This incident suggests systemic failures in our customer service training that require comprehensive review. Understood, Dr. Carter. Should I initiate our standard crisis communication protocols? Not yet. I'm still gathering information. But have media relations prepare a statement about our commitment to equal treatment of all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or any other protected characteristic. Captain Torres finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Dr. Carter, we had no idea. I sincerely apologize. Danielle ended her phone call and looked at him with an expression that was neither angry nor particularly sympathetic. It was the look of a CEO evaluating a performance failure that had significant implications for organizational reputation and federal compliance. Captain Torres, your apology is noted. However, the issue here isn't mistaken identity. The issue is that your crew treated a paying passenger with discriminatory behavior that would have been equally inappropriate regardless of who I am. The statement cut to the heart of the matter with surgical precision. The discrimination wasn't worse because it had happened to a CEO. It was unacceptable because it had happened to anyone. James Peterson, the junior flight attendant who had been Sarah's accomplice, was backing away slowly, as though distance might somehow reduce his culpability. His involvement had been minimal, but in the world of corporate liability and federal discrimination law, minimal participation in systematic bias could still have career-ending consequences. A passenger in row 4 raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, Dr. Carter. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry this happened to you. I've seen this kind of treatment before, and it's never acceptable." The woman was white, probably in her 60s, with the kind of understated elegance that suggested generational wealth. Her willingness to speak up, to acknowledge what she had witnessed and validate Danielle's experience, created a moment of human connection that transcended the corporate drama unfolding around them. "Thank you," Danielle replied warmly. "Your witness to this incident is valuable, and your willingness to speak up is appreciated." Other passengers began nodding, murmuring agreement, creating a groundswell of support that further isolated Sarah and Captain Torres. The discrimination that might have gone unchallenged in a different context was now being validated by a cabin full of witnesses who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what they had seen. The dismantling of Sarah Mitchell's career took exactly 14 minutes. At 3:23 p.m., Delta's Human Resources Director called Captain Torres's phone with instructions to immediately suspend Sarah from all duties pending a complete investigation. At 3:25 p.m., the corporate legal department activated its discrimination response protocols, beginning a process that would ultimately cost Delta $2.3 million in settlements and training reforms. At 3:31 p.m., the company's media relations team began drafting a public apology that would be reviewed by every major news organization in the country within 6 hours. But the personal consequences for Sarah began even earlier. "Sarah Mitchell," Danielle said, her voice carrying the formal tone of executive action. "Your employment with Delta Airlines is terminated effective immediately. You will be escorted from this aircraft by airport security, and your company identification, uniform, and access credentials will be revoked within the hour." The words were delivered without emotion, but they carried the weight of absolute finality. There would be no appeals process, no union grievance, no second chances. Federal discrimination law provided clear guidelines for employment termination in cases of discriminatory behavior, and Sarah's actions had been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded on multiple devices. "Please, Dr. Carter, I didn't know." Sarah's voice broke completely as the full magnitude of her situation became clear. Not only was she losing her job, but the viral nature of the incident meant that her discriminatory behavior would follow her permanently. Future employers would find video evidence of her actions with a simple internet search. "You didn't know my position," Danielle corrected, But you knew your behavior was wrong. You knew that asking me to prove my right to sit in a seat I purchased legally was discriminatory. You knew that treating me differently from other passengers based on your assumptions about race and class was inappropriate. Captain Torres attempted to salvage his own position by distancing himself from Sarah's actions. Dr. Carter, I was simply supporting my crew member's assessment of the situation. If I had known— Captain Torres, Danielle interrupted. You threatened to have me forcibly removed from the aircraft for the crime of sitting in my assigned seat. Your actions were not based on supporting your crew. They were based on the same discriminatory assumptions that motivated Ms. Mitchell. The captain's fate was sealed by his own words, all of which had been recorded. Within 2 hours, Delta's Flight Operations Center would ground him pending a complete investigation. Within a week, he would be enrolled in mandatory bias training. Within a month, he would be reassigned to domestic routes under supervisory oversight that would effectively end his career advancement. But the consequences extended far beyond individual employment actions. Delta's stock price dropped 2.7% in after-hours trading as news of the incident began spreading through social media. The video recordings made by passengers were uploaded to Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, where they quickly went viral with hashtags like Delta Discrimination and Da CEO Revenge. By evening, the incident was being discussed on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, with legal experts analyzing the federal implications of discriminating against passengers based on race. The Department of Transportation announced an investigation within 18 hours. The Federal Aviation Administration opened a review of Delta's customer service protocols within 48 hours. The NAACP issued a statement calling for comprehensive reform of airline discrimination policies within 72 hours. Danielle's phone buzzed continuously with calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and congressional staffers. The incident had transcended individual revenge and become a catalyst for industry-wide examination of discriminatory practices that had been normalized for decades. Dr. Carter, Captain Torres made one final attempt to salvage his career. Please understand that this was an isolated incident. This doesn't represent Delta's values or training. Danielle looked at him with an expression that suggested she had access to information he couldn't imagine. Captain, this incident represents exactly what it appears to represent: systematic bias that has been allowed to persist because it typically targets people without the power to fight back effectively. She gestured around the cabin, where passengers were still recording and discussing what they had witnessed. The difference today is that you chose the wrong target. But make no mistake, this treatment happens regularly to people who don't have recourse. That's what we're going to change. As airport security escorted Sarah Mitchell from the aircraft, Danielle Carter remained in seat 2A, her laptop open, typing rapidly. She was composing what would become known as the Flight 1247 memo, a comprehensive analysis of the incident that would reshape customer service training throughout the aviation industry. The memo would be precise, data-driven, and devastating in its implications. To Delta executive leadership and board of directors, she began, today's incident on Flight 1247 represents a systemic failure of our diversity training, customer service protocols, and corporate values implementation. What happened to me happens regularly to customers who lack the platform and power to demand accountability. The analysis continued for 6 pages, documenting not only the specific failures of Sarah and Captain Torres, but the broader organizational culture that had made such discrimination possible. She included recommendations for policy changes, training reforms, and oversight mechanisms that would cost Delta $50 million to implement, but would fundamentally change how the airline approached customer service. The memo concluded, "This incident should serve as a wake-up call, not because it happened to a CEO, but because it should never happen to anyone. We have an obligation to create an environment where every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or any other characteristic." As she typed, passengers continued to approach her. A young black woman in her 20s, who had been upgraded from economy, stopped by seat 2A with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Carter, I just wanted to thank you. I've experienced this kind of treatment on flights before, but I never had the power to do anything about it. Seeing you handle this, it means everything." Danielle looked up from her laptop, her expression softening for the first time since the incident began. "What's your name?" "Angela Washington. I'm a law student at Columbia." "Angela, remember this moment. Remember that dignity is not negotiable and discrimination is not acceptable, regardless of who's watching or who has the power to fight back. Your voice matters, even when it feels like no one is listening." The conversation was brief, but it encapsulated the broader significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just about corporate revenge or executive authority. It was about systemic change that would benefit people who typically had no recourse against discrimination. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a passenger in seat 3B, introduced himself as a professor of sociology at Howard University. "Dr. Carter, I'd like to document this incident for academic research, if you're willing. This represents a unique case study in how power dynamics affect discrimination response." "Of course," Danielle replied. "But I want to be clear about something. The real story isn't that a CEO fought back against discrimination. The real story is that discrimination is so normalized in our society that it takes a CEO fighting back to create accountability." She closed her laptop and looked around the cabin, where normal pre-flight activities were finally resuming. "Every person in this cabin witnessed discrimination today. Tomorrow you'll return to your lives, your jobs, your communities. The question is, will you remember what you saw here when you see it happening to someone else? Will you speak up when the victim doesn't have a corporate title or media platform?" The challenge was directed at everyone within earshot, but it carried implications far beyond the confines of Flight 1247. Danielle had weaponized her privilege not just for personal vindication, but for broader social change. Flight 1247 finally departed JFK at 4:47 p.m., 2 hours behind schedule, but carrying cargo far more valuable than its original passenger manifest suggested. 36 people would disembark in Atlanta with a story that would reshape their understanding of discrimination, privilege, and the power of accountability. As the Boeing 757 climbed toward cruising altitude, Danielle Carter was already planning her next moves. The incident report would be completed within 6 hours. The media response would be coordinated with civil rights organizations to maximize impact. The policy changes would be implemented across Delta's entire operation within 90 days. But the most important changes would happen in places she would never see. In the conversations passengers would have with their families about what they had witnessed, in the decisions future flight attendants would make when faced with similar situations, in the courage that other discrimination victims would find when they remembered that justice was possible. Her final email of the day was sent to every Delta employee, more than 75,000 people worldwide. "Today, our company failed to live up to our values. One of our passengers was discriminated against based on assumptions about race and class. This happened not because of individual bad actors, but because of systemic failures in our training and culture. Tomorrow, we begin comprehensive reforms to ensure this never happens again." But real change doesn't happen through corporate policies alone. It happens when each of us chooses to treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status. Every customer is someone's family member. Every passenger deserves to be treated the way you would want your mother, your daughter, your sister to be treated. This is not just a business imperative, it's a moral obligation. The email was leaked to the press within hours, generating additional coverage and praise for Delta's response. But for Danielle, the real measure of success wouldn't be media coverage or stock price recovery. It would be whether future passengers like Angela Washington could travel without experiencing the discrimination she had witnessed today. As Flight 1247 began its descent into Atlanta, Danielle Carter smiled for the first time since boarding. She had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change. More importantly, she had demonstrated that justice wasn't just a destination. It was a daily choice that everyone on that aircraft would now have the opportunity to make. The question was whether they would choose to make it.